Solomon and Smith.
Everybody studies Othello at the moment in the UK. All A-level is the A-level play at the moment is Othello.
Okay.
And so I spend quite a lot of time talking with students about it, really interesting ways. And what we sometimes talk about is uh, here is here is Othello, a black man in a racist white world, and here is a racist called Iago. Why is it so complicated for us to think, why does he do what he does? I mean, why have we overcomplicated that? Now, in some ways, that's an oversimplification of it, but it's rhetorically helpful in a way to think maybe we have invested Iago with this sort of occluded complexity in ways which speak to our collective unwillingness to invest that much in Othello himself.
You're about to listen to a conversation between me, Milo, and Emma Smith. Emma Smith is a Shakespeare studies scholar at the University of Oxford, Hertford College. Hopefully that's correct. She is one of my favourite Shakespeare scholars. She has a fantastic book on Shakespeare, which is just a sort of little essay gloss on each play that in every instance for me made the plays much more interesting to read. She has really excellent free lectures on the plays that I can also highly recommend. Yeah, and she just knows them extremely well and has a really lively intellectual engagement with them. I really enjoyed talking to her. We spoke about two plays, Timon of Athens and Othello. They don't really have much to do with each other. We could have tried to shoehorn the conversation in such a way that Timon and Othello are basically the same play, but we just sort of let them exist in their classic Solomon and Smith isolated capsules of conversation.
I'm sure
topic.
it'll become apparent to all who watch this that they are more or less the same play. You don't need to put a point on it. You don't have to really labor that idea. It will emerge naturally in the minds of our sophisticated audience in such a way that we need not be blunt.
Yeah,
as never we have been.
Yeah, we spoke about dual authorship. We talked about why Timon is neglected. We talked quite a bit about the manuscript history of Timon. I think we pronounced it Timon for the entire conversation.
We went Timon. You can go either way, really. It's a complicated play for that reason.
Yeah.
The eagle-eyed viewer will spot the moment I attempt to bring in the substance of the play, I am struck down by the gods and vanish from this mortal plane for a few minutes, and that was divine intervention.
Yeah.
For anyone wondering, that was actual real life God action captured, as often it is on the Solomon and Smith podcast.
Othello, we touched on just character stuff, I suppose, mostly. As she pointed out, it's very hard for me not to talk about these people as if they are real people. Why do you think Iago did that? He's not real! Brought up the Traitors television show, so we're relevant. We brought up the movie Hamnet, so we're relevant. Extremely relevant. A slight bit of a chat about the Minecraft movie might also be in here.
Yeah, there's a section where we discuss in great detail the Minecraft movie. Ignore that.
Jason Momoa's performance, pretty good. He'd be a good Iago. Discuss.
Down in the comment section, Jason Momoa.
Jason Momoa as Iago. How would that be?
Who would be as Othello?
Jack Black, of course.
Not
Jack Black. It would have to be Jack Black.
It couldn't be Jack Black. See, we've already started the discussion.
Yeah, Jack Black as Othello. Yeah.
Aptly named.
That is 5D chess. Barry White, very unaptly named. Apt in other ways. Jack White misses both. Misses on both counts.
Definitely not Jack White and Jason Momoa.
Yeah, Jack White cannot play Othello. I will die on this hill It's he doesn't get the role. That's the reason. He has the wrong psychology to really get in the Othello role.
Too whiny. That's not what it's
Yeah.
about. It's not about why. Oh, she doesn't like me. That's not the play.
It's not what Othello's about. Jack White has a family. Othello, does he have a family? Oh, an interesting thing about
Not that we
Othello's
know of.
family I wish I'd brought up is that because he overlaps with Timon in the sense that we don't know about his background. We don't know whether Othello is a North African or a Sub-Saharan African, whether he's an Arab or whether he's black. We don't know whether Othello is Muslim or converted Christian. That's kind of unclear. Lots about Othello's background is unknown, and in the title appellation, the Moor of Venice is in some ways kind of misleading because he's not of there. He's loaned out to there, and like Timon, he's a male character without this family background, with the exception of two contradictory accounts on where the handkerchief comes from. Because I didn't notice this. Yeah, the one where it's his mother and it's a very important magical object that is given to his father, where the mother's like a witch and has imbued this handkerchief with this very magical essence and gives it to the father. Then he mentions it again as a handkerchief that his father gave to his mother, but without any of the magic in there. So two contradictory accounts, which makes us, I don't know, maybe Shakespeare just made a continuity error, or maybe Shakespeare is, maybe Othello's lying about one of them, possibly the one with the magic, because that's the time when he's jealous and he wants Desdemona to reveal.
Best he could come up with it on the spot. I mean, it's tough.
Yeah.
Sometimes you get stuck in a corner and you just say your mum was a witch and put magic in the. It's just a handkerchief, really.
Handkerchief,
but
yeah.
Maybe she'll buy it. I don't know.
Why couldn't the father have been a magician who put magic in the handkerchief? Why? It's interesting that the gender switch in the stories. Maybe Shakespeare does that in order for you to realize that the stories don't match up with each other. Maybe there's something else going on there. Yeah, weird, interesting detail.
He doesn't have that, but he does have the military past. That's the only thing we really know about him.
Yeah, exactly. Both of them, they're kind of faceless, identityless men who are of cities that they're not really of in the title page.
Well, Timon might be of Athens.
Oh, yeah, okay.
We have no reason to assume he has some lands down to Lacedaemon, but he could be of Athens.
I thought it said he was from Lacedaemon. No.
I think he just said my land's extended, but because no one's read this play, we can make some
we can make some stuff up. Yeah, it says that Timon is from Leeds, as the play clearly says in black and white. It's funny
does state that.
Yeah, Timon of Athens. Like, first of all, no one's read it, and then secondly, many of the people watching this podcast are not going to go away and read Timon of Athens, which means we've got free reign. We can make up the plot of a Shakespeare play. It's Karl Marx's favorite.
Yeah. Does it exist in the first place?
Is there anything about about Timon that you'd like to say here before the podcast, which has no talk of Timon?
Well, I think it's good to mention that it's a great play, beloved by all members of this podcast outfit. Emma seems to come on Team Timon. I think when pressed, she's pretty keen to see it reproduced. The implication was clear that we have the full backing of Emma Smith, Shakespeare scholar, in reproduction.
I mean, she's on the RSC board as well, I think.
There you go.
We're in. Yeah, our Timon is going to the top, baby, all the way.
We get rich off this. Start digging up gold bars. That's what it's all about. Wish I was Timon. It's a wish fulfillment play for me.
We didn't. Again, no one's going to laugh because no one's read Timon of Athens.
Didn't even mention Apomantus, everyone's favorite.
Yeah, what a character. Flavius! The Flavius-Timon relationship, and compared to the Iago-Othello relationship,
yeah,
there's an interesting point of contact.
Yeah, the only point which in Timon is really human to human emotional is Flavius's return when
Yeah.
he's out in the dirt and they share a moment. And that's a Middleton scene. All the Shakespeare stuff is just like thunderbolts and ruin. But
Mm.
within scene 14, which is all Shakespeare, except a couple of insertions, one of which being Flavius the steward. And there's this moment of human kindness and a conciliation. Very nice to
Mm.
have. I watched the Jonathan Pryce BBC version the other day, the only recorded version, and naturally only exists because they were doing all of them and through gritted teeth had to film Timon raging all the while. But that scene between Timon, Jonathan Pryce, and the steward it's very touching.
Mm.
Othello almost begins with the sort of abandoned invasion of Cyprus by the Turks in
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
weather and battle, whereas Timon ends with the abandoned invasion of Athens. In both
Yes.
cases,
Yes.
and historically, the Turkish invasion mentioned in Othello was in fact a Turkish success. They won that
Ah.
battle, and Shakespeare's audience would have been familiar with the general layout at least. Whereas in this version of history, obviously non-specific, the Turks are
Mm.
beaten back, and we have an alternate kind of history. And
Yeah.
then Timon's the sacking of Athens presumably did not happen by Alcibiades.
I mean, isn't it just the winds in Othello that they're not actually beaten
Yeah,
back? Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. It's just the winds. The fleet is
Yeah.
there, but they don't engage.
I love that we don't have any evidence that Othello is actually a good warrior. It's just he's got this reputation. So, like, oh, now we've got Othello on our side. We can, and then the winds dispel the Turkish fleet, and
Yeah, maybe he is magical. This is the subtext.
wow,
He has
yeah, yeah.
wind powers.
Yeah. Has anyone ever thought that Othello, from his witch mother, has actually inherited the power to move the wind? The witches
This
in
could be
Macbeth, don't they create a storm? Their
I
ships
think
shall be
in yeah,
tempest tossed or something like this, and
and in
uh,
The Tempest, there's plenty
yeah,
of storm magic. Maybe this
yeah.
is the real thread through all
God, wait
Shakespeare.
a minute. Othello might be a magician who whose warrior reputation is based on his ability to conjure storms.
And then Brabantio's comment about, she was charmed with
Yeah,
witchcraft.
yeah,
Just true. He did a few of the spells. He had a magic handkerchief that, as long as she possessed it, would keep him in his power. But
yeah.
because it went missing, he suddenly feared she hasn't got the magic handkerchief.
Mm.
This is a big problem for my spells that I have wound. She will go astray.
Yeah. God. Othello as magician. Yeah,
Yeah, there's a new thesis idea. Forget Timon.
yeah.
Straight
Boring
into
play.
Othello.
Who's
Yeah.
heard of it?
There's an interesting line. The world is but a word. This is from Timon, so I
Mm.
could have made it up. But I assure you, in Timon, it is said, the world is but a word, which feels like
Yeah,
something that Iago could have said. And the way
yeah.
he
No, true.
weaves this world, and in Timon, it's a sense of credit, a sense of you have these depths, and the word makes it true. For Iago, he creates the drama, but it is just basically, yes, he creates some circumstantial evidence with certain magic handkerchiefs, but in general, he creates the world with his words. Obviously, he creates it for us as well.
Mm.
And Othello believes it to such an extent that it does enter into reality, insofar as Desdemona is killed for a certain crime. Later,
Mm.
this crime becomes untrue, but the world is the word in that moment.
Yeah, it's like a magician. The world changes when you utter some specific mouth sounds with semantic content, or without abracadabra.
Or without, yeah.
Yeah.
The sounds themselves,
Yeah.
these things. And Othello himself becomes less articulate. That's part of
Yeah,
Iago's
yeah.
anti-magic. His spells begin to slip. He can't quite say things as lyrically as he
Yeah,
did. He sort of
he
repeats
starts
himself.
to
He
pray
stumbles.
with most potent grave and reverence, and then he's just blah, blah, blood, zoons,
Yeah, and you get the
handkerchief, ah,
interesting repetition between Iago and Othello when they just start kind of mirroring each other. And
yeah, yeah,
initially Iago's mirroring Othello, but later on Othello starts doing the same thing. Iago will
mm,
say something like "lie on her," and he'll be like, "Lie on her?
mm,
How?" Iago is another magician who is competing with the magician
Of
Othello.
Othello. Iago's the modern Renaissance magician, the Machiavellian magician, and Othello is the classical ancient world magician. At the end of the play, Iago being this empty vessel also reminds me. It's a loose metaphor, but the empty chest in Timon that's sent around to all of his would-be friends, his friends in inverted commas, and the chest remains empty. In the same way, that's Iago. He's sent around to all of the characters, an empty vessel, and then comes back and he's opened up. You open him up in the end of the play to see what's in there, what's in the chest, what have all these characters imparted in this man, in this chest, and there's nothing there. He's just silence.
Nothing, yeah.
At the end of the play. There is no one inside him.
It's an interesting note to end the play on. Is just, yeah, we'll torture him lots. Don't worry.
We'll torture him to death. Yeah.
Yeah, there's some good alternate endings that most productions don't tend to end there. I think there's some nice places to end with Othello, with his death. I'm glad that we know that the real Iago did indeed die from torture. That warms my heart.
Yeah. He would have wanted it that way. Yeah.
True, that's Iago universe triumphs. Othello universe dies.
In the Minecraft movie, the pigs die, like a baby pig gets stabbed. When Iago says, "I am not what I am," there are two potential biblical quotes that he's riffing on. One is St. Paul, I can't remember which book, they all blend with that fella, who says, "By the grace of God, I am what I am." And then, perhaps more obviously, there is the name of God uttered to Moses from the burning bush. It's like about a decade before the King James comes out, Othello.
Yeah, but we did have English translations around, knocking about. And the King James is largely composed of just compilation of previous. It was a very conservative sort of edition. So I think, I forget the Bible that Shakespeare would have known. The Bishop's Bible, one of these things. I feel like that "I am that I am," such a classic line. That must have been knocking about the parishes.
Yeah, he says, "I am not what I am," rather than "I am not that I am." I am not that I am. What a statement that is. Whoa. How do you get around that? Whoa. I am not.
But he says lots of things that are hard to get around, like this kind of if I was Othello and you were Iago,
then I would be me. It sounds almost like Trinitarianism debates. Yeah, but if you're me and I'm not you, but we're all God.
It is as sure as you are Roderigo. Were I the Moor, I would not be Iago. In following him, I follow but myself.
So it's so Satan and Paradise Lost. It's just you hear the echo is so strong. Big roar. Hi.
Hello.
Great to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Not at all.
Yeah, we start these chats with a poetic epigraph. So this is from Emily Dickinson. I thought it would be quite nice in relation to both plays. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased, with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. What, if any, exposure, Emma, did you have to poetry or theatre when you were growing up?
Not much to theatre. Probably more to poetry. I read a lot, went to the library a lot as a child. So yeah, I was a reader, and part of that was poetry, but that wasn't my great love, I think.
What was your first great love in reading?
It's a really good question. I feel as if it was almost quantity rather than individual things. So because I didn't own very many books, mine was not an experience of rereading favorites, but of a sense there are all these hundreds of books, and a sort of a appetite to get across those. I think that's what I most remember. I had quite a good sort of triage system in the library about books that could be read in time, or sitting on one of those little children's
Mm.
chairs, and books that needed to be taken out. And I knew, quite clearly how long you had to read them. So yeah, it was. It's probably the wrong answer to say quantity rather than quality, but that was what I was. It felt like a massive new undiscovered world, and I was just sort of eager for it, I think.
Mm. And so you came to theatre and watching plays much later. Was this initially like always Shakespeare when in relation to your academic interests, or do you
Yeah,
remember your first? Yeah.
yeah. I suppose I was interested in popular writing when I came. I'd done a very I'd done a very sort of literary elite degree. The English degree at Oxford is a canonical degree, and that tends to be about yeah, a kind of aesthetic elite, but very often, other kinds of elite. And I maybe reacted against that by trying to think about popular forms. And so I wrote my doctoral dissertation on popular theatre of the Elizabethan period, which actually mostly wasn't Shakespeare. And I partly wanted to say, which is actually true. I mean, Shakespeare's extreme dominance of that field is a later is belated. I don't think people in the Elizabethan period knew they were living in the age of Shakespeare. Not everybody else. It's not like the situation in Amadeus, where Salieri realizes he's a perfectly good composer, but he has the terrible disadvantage to be born, living at the same time as
Mm.
Mozart. I don't think the other writers felt that about Shakespeare. So I wrote about popular theatre, but then I came to think that Shakespeare was a meeting point between sort of academic criticism, theatre making, a wider public enjoyment and engagement, creative reimaginings, and so on. And so Shakespeare became the sort of inevitable center of the Venn diagram, I guess.
Yeah.
Only in my 20s, I suppose, and beyond.
Mm. And just on that point, what kind of exposure would Shakespeare have had to theatre growing up? What was the theatre culture of someone in rural England in
Yeah,
Stratford?
it's a
If it
really
was there at
interesting.
all, what was he seeing as a young boy, as a young man?
Yeah, there's been a huge amount of effort to try and imagine what that was, to see whether there was still any vestige of the biblical plays which toured around late medieval England. What were those still possibly overlapping with the young Shakespeare? Many critics feel that he must have gone to the entertainment for Queen Elizabeth at Kenilworth, which is not far from Stratford in Warwickshire, partly because everybody, it seemed to have pulled everybody there. So that might be a possibility. We know a little bit about touring theatre, going to market towns like Stratford upon Avon. But the only place to encounter theatre regularly is London. And Shakespeare is growing up just as theatre is becoming established as a fixed metropolitan entertainment rather than, or as well as, but in some ways rather than a kind of travelling occasional one.
Yeah. Do we know much about what he would have seen, or
No.
is it mostly guesswork,
Yeah,
if
we
at
don't
all? Yeah.
we don't even know what was performed, so
Right.
let alone whether
Oh.
he saw it,
Mhm.
apart from this entertainment at Kenilworth. And there's a moment when Puck is describing a sort of magical image in Midsummer Night's Dream about the dolphin, um, which many people imagine is a reference to one of the great spectacles at the Kenilworth entertainment. But that again, that's sort of guesswork.
There seems to be a recent trend. I don't know whether it's also in Shakespeare studies in an academic context, but in the sort of broad culture of reading a lot more biography into Shakespeare's works than it seems previous generations did. It seems fashionable previously to proclaim that Shakespeare is nowhere present in his works, and now we were just talking, me and Milo, about the Hamnet movie recently. It seems that maybe ours is just an age that's more interested in authorial biography than before. But what do you think of these sorts of developments?
It's interesting to think whether it's a development. I think it's a return to something we've previously been interested in. So the middle of the 20th century was very fierce about Shakespeare's unknowability and tried to turn that into his greatest sort of theatrical literary asset so that he isn't proclaiming a particular allegiance or he isn't talking about particular Elizabethan or Jacobean experiences or Shakespeare experiences, and that makes him able to be more widely resonant or, not of an age but for all time, as Ben Jonson puts it. Um, but I guess we are in an age which has a high value on personal testimony, don't we? As the kind of memoir, the confessional. We're very annoyed when those writings turn out to be not as true as they seem to claim. There are always outcries about this. So maybe we're in a moment where we want Shakespeare to be the idea of a Shakespeare who isn't visible in his writing seems rather evasive to us. We want a Shakespeare who is a bit more visible and who has some commitments. I think it's connected to the idea which has become much more popular. It used to be an absolutely niche view, which was that Shakespeare might have been a Catholic or might have retained more elements of pre-Reformed faith than was entirely wise. I think that too, in part, derives from a wish for Shakespeare to believe in something, because that's one of the ways we praise our artists now. They have commitments, they have beliefs, and they are willing to stand up for them. Whereas maybe in the past we were more interested in the artist who is, in a sort of T.S. Eliot sense, a bit more anonymous.
Mm.
Do we know in an Elizabethan context whether the theatre was ever considered as a confessional form? Just in our last episode, we were talking about the Earl of Rochester, and some of his theatre seems very clearly to sort of resemble his personality and his opinions. But would it have been expected by a Shakespearean audience to even look for Shakespeare in the play, or was he simply the maker and perhaps the actor, and the rest said itself?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It's not an obvious form to use for personal expression, and in some ways, there's been lots of interesting research on how the Elizabethan schoolroom encouraged the kind of ventriloquism of different voices, being being skilled in seeing different points of view rather than being skilled in putting your own point of view in a persuasive way. And that theatre, in some ways, is a version of that, that you have to be able to make different points of view of the world seem equally valid. Otherwise, you don't have a play. You don't have a play of interlocking characters with a different sense of the world. So I don't think that Elizabethan audiences would have looked for that. And one of the things I am always interested in about Shakespeare is that quite early in his career, before he's established as a playwright, the theatres are closed for the plague in sort of late 1592 3, and he has to turn to lyric poetry. He writes Venus and Adonis first, and then Lucrece, and these seem to be massively successful print in a print form. And poetry isn't personal either in this period, but it perhaps has a bit more capacity to look like that. But once the theatres reopen, Shakespeare just doesn't continue that possible outlet for his work at all. So he does seem committed to theatre as the genre that he's interested in, and with that, the kind of personal invisibility, perhaps.
Mm.
And it's not even clear that Shakespeare would have been known as the maker of all of his plays, certainly not perhaps early on, it doesn't seem this one of the many shifts that happens over the time Shakespeare is writing seems to be a perhaps an increased interest in the writer as the sort of progenitor of the play, rather than seeing plays as productions by acting companies or theatrical venues.
Milo and I were speaking the other day about how the status of a writer in modern theatre tends to be higher than the director. They tend to be more well known. They tend to have penetrated the culture more. Theatre directors are known within the specialist circle of theatre, but and it was interesting to compare this to film. Where the opposite is the case. The directors' names are known, and the writers live in this anonymity.
Mm.
Uh,
I think that model of the writing room, of a more collaborative or less sort of authored, if you like, idea of where a script might come from is quite a helpful way for defamiliarizing the way the Elizabethan theatre might have worked. And there's a lot of interest now. Alongside that interest in biography is an interest in Shakespeare as a collaborative writer. A lot of the most recent editions, most particularly perhaps the New Oxford Shakespeare, which came out in 2016, have been really eager and sophisticated in finding a Shakespeare for whom perhaps about a quarter, maybe more than that, of the works we attribute to him may well be co-written in some form with other writers. So it may be that there's a sort of dissonance in a way between how we have constructed Shakespeare as the great bard and the great author, and how his authorship actually was and how it was perceived in his own time.
should we move on to Timon actually on the subject
On
of
the collaboration, yeah,
yeah,
great.
yeah. Milo's mostly going to be taking Timon, and I'm mostly going to be taking Othello.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Timon, I think to start with Timon is the play. It's a little bit of a mystery in terms of its appearance and its history and exactly what it is and where it came from. As far as I'm aware, its textual history, as far as we have it, begins with the folio, and it was given a place it wasn't initially intended to have. And had it not been put there, we would simply have no knowledge of its existence whatsoever. Can you fill us in a little bit on exactly what happened there?
Yeah. So the book we now call the First Folio is the collected edition of Shakespeare's plays, which is gathered together by two of his fellow actors, John Hemmings and Henry Condell, posthumously. So Shakespeare dies in 1616, and this book comes out in 1623. And it includes 36 plays, 18 of which had been previously printed, and 18 of which appear for the first time here. So Timon isn't unique in only appearing in the First Folio. Macbeth, Twelfth Night, Julius Caesar, they also, Tempest, and etc. They also do. But what is unique is that as the First Folio book was being put together, it's relatively easy for the stationers to have access to unpublished work because they just get it from the theatre company. But where work's been previously published, the rights sit with other publishers. So they're negotiating the rights to reprint. And they're negotiating quite hard with a man called Henry Whalley, who owns the rights to Troilus and Cressida. And Whalley just seems not to want to play. And in fact, the book continues through the press. The First Folio book continues through the press without Troilus and Cressida being planned as part of it. And it's in that space that Timon of Athens comes. And we know that because of various anomalies about the pagination and the way that book is put together. So it does seem that Timon was a kind of B-list or a filler when Troilus and Cressida was not going to be available. In fact, Troilus and Cressida does become available, and that gets in as well. And that may speak to the more general ambivalence there seems to be in the First Folio collection around obviously collaborative work. So a play that's generally thought to be written by Shakespeare with George Wilkins, Pericles, isn't in the First Folio. His collaboration with Fletcher, Two Noble Kinsmen isn't in the First Folio. The other collaboration with Fletcher, Cardenio, is lost entirely, never gets printed. So it may be that the First Folio, which if people think they don't know what we're talking about, you probably sort of do, because that picture of Shakespeare with a bald head, that engraving, that's the frontispiece of that big book. And part of commissioning a portrait of Shakespeare seems to be, in some ways, back to that question of biography. In a way, it seems to be saying what you're getting here is the solo mind of this great writer. This is what this book represents, rather than, for example, Ben Jonson has a collection of his plays, and he has the sort of allegorical figures of comedy and tragedy, a picture of a classical theatre. So that's trying to do something quite different in saying, what's this book about? Yeah, so it does look as if Timon of Athens is a survival, sort of circumstantial survival. And as you say, what I love about that story, which can seem a bit dusty, is that, as you say, if that hadn't happened, we wouldn't know anything about Timon of Athens. There's no mention of it. There's no performance records, no other allusion to it before that. So not only would we not have it, we wouldn't know that we didn't have it. And it's interesting.
Unknown.
Yeah, an unknown, exactly. And it's really interesting to think whether this is the only unknown. I mean, now a known, but could have been an unknown. Are there others?
I think
interesting that it's an afterthought, because today it sort of still remains an afterthought among the tragedies.
Quite, absolutely. I think people have found it very difficult to incorporate into the canon when it has been successful in recent performance. I think, for example, of what was a really landmark National Theatre production by Nick Hytner with Simon Russell Beale as Timon.
2008 crisis.
Yeah, exactly.
Stuff,
in the aftermath of the financial crash, it got a lot of energy from the sort of strange moment of late capitalism that we seem to be in then, but it also got a lot of energy from patching in from other play texts. There's some bits of Pericles in there. There's a lot of script doctoring done to make the play work, as well as the circumstances in which it finds a voice. So it is still a really marginal play, which is an extraordinary thing to say, isn't it? Given this is the most studied, the most over-studied, if you like, playwright. Timon is still. So if anyone's listening and wants a, thesis topic or wants a private research topic, Timon would be a good place to be.
And it brings in an interesting point, bringing in Pericles and trying to fix the text. This sense that there is, at least in the English scholarship, something wrong with Timon, and various strange features about it. There are sort of scenes that imply completions that never come. We've got a bit of a wonky ending. It feels maybe incomplete. And some people have said maybe this was from a draft, maybe it was never finished. What can we say about that? Is it definitely an unfinished play? Did it definitely not get performed? Or are we trying to work out explanations for how it is the way it is?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because in some ways, problems. The problem of Timon is always a contextual one. I mean, it's a problem in relation to some sense of how it ought to have been or what a play would look like. It clearly is not, to me at least, an unfinished go at a tragic play like King Lear. That's to say, I think this is probably a Shakespeare who is trying to push the genre of tragedy further than he has done, or see how far you can push it before it breaks. How far can you sort of take away the personality of the central tragic character? How far can you reduce sympathy? How far can you break the sense of an arc of cause and effect? So this feels experimental. It feels as if it was always experimental. So I think some of the things that have been seen to be problems may well have been entirely intentional, in the way that if you think The Winter's Tale should be a comedy, you will find it unsatisfactory in lots of ways. But we know Shakespeare is perfectly able to write standard comedies. So, another way of seeing it is he's trying to do something different here. I guess what's also not helped Timon's reputation is that we still have a perhaps rather a negative view of collaboration. That's partly that the collaborative work must be broken in some way. You must be able to see the gap. No brilliant work is ever sort of collaborative, however you define the collaboration. That's one assumption. I don't believe it, but it's an assumption. And the other is that if you're Shakespeare, whoever you collaborate with is not as good as you.
Yeah.
And therefore, that somehow, in a way, that the idea that Timon is a collaboration with Middleton is also, Milo, kind of an answer to your question, because we don't know that either for sure. We don't know that externally. Nobody writes in a diary, saying I've paid Middleton to, work with Shakespeare, or there's no evidence of that sort. There's only internal evidence. And one sort of radical view might be to say that that the role of Middleton has been somehow to allow this apparently Shakespearean play not to seem not very good. That it's the collaboration that's spoilt it.
Yeah,
So
which always
I think
seems
your
like a
question
very
about how you look at it is absolutely germane. It's hard to see how these plays are intrinsically. It's all about, in a way, the framework, or glancing obliquely, or askance. I'm sorry, I've lost the lovely Dickinson you began with, Jack. But see, it is sort of seeing from the side, isn't it? Mm.
Yeah, and it's often convenient to palm off a weaker part of a collaborative work with the author you like less.
Exactly.
It's possible that a lesser author can accidentally come out with genius, and that for the greater author to slip.
Yeah.
But it's less convenient. But I'm interested, if we see Timon as this slight anomaly, was it thought to be known? If it was unperformed, would it have been in any circulation, or would it simply known by people close to the publishers, close to Middleton, if it were Middleton, and Shakespeare, and a sort of private knowledge of this thing that made its way into the folio?
Yeah, that's absolutely all speculative. So, as we were saying, we don't have any reference to Timon, so it doesn't seem to have had any impact on anybody else. And therefore, that may suggest that its circulation was very, very, very limited. There's no evidence about performance, but to be fair, there's not a lot of hard evidence about performance dates for quite a number of plays, and we don't tend to assume that they were never performed. So that absence of performance information has corroborated the sense of the problems with the text to make it seem sort of specifically meaningful about Timon, whereas that's just an absence of evidence we have elsewhere. So it's a really interesting sort of counterclaim to think about this as a Middleton play, rather than to think about Middleton sort of having some part in a Shakespeare play, but to think, how would you put this as a Middleton play? Nobody collects Middleton's plays together at his after his death. He doesn't have the work done for him like Shakespeare does, and it's been not until the very late 20th century that there was a collected Middleton which tried to sort of get a grasp of everything that he had written. Yeah, but maybe it's with him, along with there's quite a lot of Middleton thought to be now in the Shakespeare canon, but most of it imagined as a sort of revision of the play after Shakespeare's death. Measure for Measure, Macbeth, All's Well, Titus, rather than as a sort of real-time collaboration, which most arguments suggest Timon is the only one.
And do we have any information about any unstaged plays that might have had a circulation in Elizabethan or Jacobean theatre? Was this a thing? Or is that, I mean, there's the notion that maybe Seneca's plays way back when were sort of academic plays, maybe not intended to be performed. And I'm not sure if I buy that, but is this a notion that even existed in the theatrical scene of this time?
It's a good thing to bring in. Yeah, there are definitely closet plays in the Senecan mode. But if you have a play the Tragedy of Mariam by Elizabeth Carey, for instance, Mary Sidney's Antony, lots and lots of well, quite a number of these. Seneca is known and published and translated in the English print scene. So that concept does exist. You're absolutely right. I suppose what's more difficult for Timon is that those are all examples that survive because they're printed. So if you have a play which is neither performed nor printed, I mean, like The Tree in the Forest, in a way,
Yeah.
does it exist at all? And it doesn't seem, yeah. There's a brilliant, as I'm speaking, I'm just thinking about a brilliant website called lostplays.org, which tries to reconstruct the 80% of plays from this period that have not survived, usually because they were not printed. And it's really interesting thinking about what might the evidence, what bits of evidence might you try and sort of piece together to think about this lost material.
Because it does create this interesting universe in which there might have been quite a few completely lost Shakespeare plays, which may have been for different purposes, may have been more private. I mean, again, reading Earl of Rochester, you hear a lot of his poems were distributed in very few fine manuscript copies, and that was it. They were only intended for a very small print run, in the way that a mass print run was seen as perhaps more general of an audience. But again, complete
Yeah, I mean,
speculation
Rochester's
there.
position is interesting, isn't it? There's an elite circulation, and elite circulation is still, in the Shakespearean period, also in the Elizabethan and Jacobean period, is also scribal. That's to say, it's not print. So we used to talk about manuscript circulation and print, and now we tend to talk about scribal publication and print publication. So that is to say, both these forms are forms of publication. It isn't that one is private and one is public, but perhaps they differ in scale, although in some ways not so much. Some of the networks of how manuscripts travel suggest, a really, really wide readership for manuscript work. But there's definitely, you're right, a status thing about print versus manuscript, and manuscript circulation still seems a kind of higher, higher status. But your point that there could be more lost Shakespeare or more lost parts of Shakespeare, I think is exactly the charge, isn't it, of that unknown about the First Folio. So if Timon of Athens was the first thing that you were thinking, yeah, we'll get this if we can't get these other things. What if the publishers were not of the First Folio had not been able to get something like Richard III, say, which was quite a good seller in single quarto, so might have been expensive, and somebody might not have wanted to give up the rights. Did they have another thing after Timon that they were going to put in that we have now lost? I mean, what's happened to Love's Labour's One, which is a title, a Shakespeare title, which has a couple of witnesses but no text attached to it? And should we take that a bit more seriously as a potentially lost play?
And there's the tendency for the things that go lost to be, like Timon, to be very eccentric, uneven, which I suppose in our current moment tend to be the things that interest us disproportionately. Eccentric art from the past.
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
from classical music, that all the Baroque stuff that has weird atonal harmonies in it is the stuff that fascinates people and sort of delights them the most.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And that some of the ways, and I suppose we've moved on in literary critical terms as well, from feeling that the job of literary criticism is to sort of praise and polish the work's perfections, to thinking, the literary work shows its origins or shows its struggles or shows what's going on under the surface is the bits that don't quite fit or are a bit
Mm.
anomalous, or the bits where it's kind of showing the strain a bit. Yeah, definitely.
Do you like Timon, Emma? Is it not one of your favorites? Or because me and Milo are both inordinately fond of it, despite its weirdness.
I mean, I
I
think it's deeply
yeah.
weird. I think, I mean, I think it's a really interesting extended case of, I mean, something that I mentioned when we were just planning a bit for this conversation. I mean, T Timon takes the what I would say to be the misogyny of Shakespeare's tragedies to an extreme point in that it imagines a person and a world without women, really. It takes the family drama that is so much part of Shakespeare's tragedies. It's the death of Hamlet's father. It's the ingratitude of his daughters for Lear. Or it's the claim of the mother and the wife on Coriolanus. It's as if Timon, with Timon, Shakespeare or Shakespeare and Middleton, sort of tried to imagine what would a person be like without any of those constraints. Timon has no family.
Mm.
It's like a Johnson character, Ben Jonson character, more than a Shakespeare one. Almost no characters in Shakespeare have no family.
Yeah. Or,
Um,
or indeed,
uh,
or indeed a medieval character, like from a mystery play, and
yeah,
Mr.
exactly.
Rich
Or
Man. Yeah.
exactly, or two of them, isn't it? First Mr. Rich
Mm.
Man and then Mr. Poor Man,
Mr.
or
Grumpy in a
first,
hole
yeah, first,
man.
philanthropist and then misanthrope. Yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. So I think it is absolutely fascinating. The only production I have seen where I have thought it has worked on the stage was the Heitner one. So it's ripe for another. To me, it's ripe for a new production sometime now.
Milo, you want
And I think it's well,
to?
had some ideas, but
Mm.
I think it's interesting. The only time that Timon was really popular on the English stage, as far as I can tell, for a prolonged period, was the Thomas Shadwell version from the 17th and 18th centuries. And crucially, he adds two female characters
Yeah.
centrally
Mm.
around Timon, as though this is something the play is wanting. And certainly, it's a key to a more tragic and dramatic axis that maybe is missing from the version we get. And you can see it almost as a negative argument. This might be reading into it, but this is sort of the world unfeminized, this sort of unlivable, almost unwatchable apocalypse that
Mhm.
occurs. And then Shadwell's solution is where you just put some female characters in, and suddenly it's what, you can really enjoy this thing in a way that you previously can't. But I think the question of Timon's reputation becomes maybe more interesting given that in Central Europe and a bit of Eastern Europe, it's a lot better regarded than in
Yeah.
England. I
Yeah.
mean, you can name the big names. You can say Marx, Brecht,
Yeah.
Schiller. They all think this is not merely eccentrically interesting, but one of the great works.
Mm.
Why do you think there is this divide between the English dismissal? I mean, Pope tried to fix it. Various other of these scholars tried to sort of put things in footnotes
Mm.
and work around the problems. Whereas you have these great playwrights and thinkers further east who see this play and think this is marvelous.
Yeah, that's such a smart observation. And in some ways we might be able to answer it with a more familiar play like Hamlet. And I suppose the Western Hamlet is valued for character psychology, depth of character. In the West, Hamlet is a Hamlet himself, Hamlet's dilemma, Hamlet's feelings, Hamlet's relation with his mother, Hamlet's, all that stuff. That's always been crucial to it. And there's a parallel, similar centrality of Hamlet in the former Eastern Europe, in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, which is about politics and structure, which is about who has what, uh, how power works, how society works, how society could be better, and is not individual really at all. And I wonder if Timon is more in that structural idea. Jack, when you said it's like a medieval character, that's that's a sort of representative figure who tells us something about the world rather than a idiosyncratic or interiorized figure who tells us something about himself. And I wonder if that's more visible. I mean, if you look at what Marx says about Timon, for instance, I mean, it's an absolutely structural commodity understanding of the value or not value of money, the value of gold in different contexts. He's less troubled by the fact that Timon has, two epitaphs, seems to die twice and also not at all, and two epitaphs, and those things which have been so problematic in the Western tradition. So again, maybe that's a question back to your previous question about it depends what we think this play ought to be, how problematic we think it is that it isn't that. And if we think this should be Hamlet, and I think some critical lines of thought in the West probably have felt that it should be a Western Hamlet, then you'll find it disappointing.
And Jack mentioned recently, there's also an interesting kinship, someone like Goethe and Faust and these kind of German romantic characters who wail against the universe and in their wretchedness become almost heroic. And we kind of see hints of this in Lear, but again in Lear it's more pathetic and damned and damaged, which is in Timon too. But perhaps there is just this character archetype, man against world,
Yeah.
which appeals more, is more philosophical perhaps and less dramatic. Because a
Yeah,
lot of
that
the
it's a
failings
sort
of
of
Timon
yeah,
are
it's a kind
dramatic.
of Caspar Friedrich kind of portrait or something. That's to say, somebody alone, sort of shouting into the world, into the void.
All of them from the Protestant part of Germany as well.
Yes, that's
Not,
really interesting.
yeah.
That's really interesting. So it's a form of the sublime, a kind of awful, as in AWE, awful sort of confrontation with the world. Yeah, naked kind of confrontation with the world. Yeah, I agree.
And
think it's really
I
interesting.
think this leads kind of back to the frontispiece of the folio with the famous bold-headed Shakespeare looking out as this unitary solo genius. I'm curious because the theatre, the London theatre, is still relatively new in its then form. Was this the earliest or one of the earliest proclamations of single genius in the theatre? Where does it fit? Because now we have the cult of genius and we've deconstructed it, reconstructed it round and again. But Middleton didn't have
Yeah.
Middleton collected, and we say Johnson had the dramatic masks. So was Shakespeare really one of the first to be given this? He is the genius.
Yeah, so we always say about that book, The First Folio, that it is uh, a, an anomaly when most plays don't get printed at all. If they are printed, they're printed in cheap pamphlet copies. The public theatre is not a high status literary or cultural venue, whereas the folio book format is, and there seemed to be a sort of dissonance between those two. It certainly seems one argument is that the collection of Shakespeare is trying to make a case for drama as literary rather than as theatrical. So in some ways, the First Folio does engage with itself as a product of the theatre and does mention the theatre, but in other ways, it seems to be trying to get loose from the associations of the theatre and say this is a big book that it's worth you spending serious time with and taking seriously. So it's almost a way of taking Shakespeare out of the theatre, and perhaps part of the way of taking Shakespeare out of the theatre is to lean into the singular author model, which is less common in theatrical writing, but more common in lyric poetry, for instance, or other higher status forms, so that maybe they go together. That as you publish plays in a format which is going to prioritize reading, you also reimagine the author as the kind of author we are used to thinking is worth reading, and that's a more singular one. But definitely, it's a development, and it's not really a development that sticks. So we get Johnson's folio, which he himself overseas in 1616. We get this one in 1623, and then we get Beaumont and Fletcher in 1647. But either this isn't a runaway success as a model, or other playwrights are not susceptible to it, or it doesn't succeed in creating the market that it's trying to build.
Do we know
It's
that?
interesting.
Go on.
Oh, go on. Well, I was just going to say that it's interesting, almost borrowing the grammar from a different form. So Shakespeare must be solo because if this were lyric poetry, it would be solo. It's not a collaborator's medium. Therefore, it makes sense to bias against the more obviously collaborative works and to
Yeah,
not credit the collaborators when they are
yeah,
included. And
yeah.
then it's almost like a canny business idea, which seems to explain a lot of strange anomalies of Elizabethan Jacobean practice, but a
Yes.
canny business plan rather than an announcement of this new kind of theatre, this new kind of genius.
I think that's absolutely true. And I think there are many aspects of the First Folio publication, presentation and publication, that we have read in hindsight as if they are early declarations of Shakespeare's unique genius, or um, that they have an insight and say into the quality of the plays previously printed. So for a long time, we thought, following the First Folio preface, that if a play exists in two versions from the um, 16th and early 17th century of Shakespeare play, like King Lear, for example, or Hamlet, the folio is the better one. And we just assumed that that was true because these people who had known Shakespeare and knew the theatre world told us it was. But I think once you start to see this is an expensive undertaking, this book, it's quite a risky one because it doesn't occupy a particular market slot already. Any creative writer who's been dead for kind of 7 or 8 years is probably in quite a lull in their reputation. It's not immediately capitalizing on nostalgia after their death, and it's not quite had time to go through a cycle of rediscovery by a later generation. So there are lots of ways in which I think publishing the First Folio was probably commercially quite iffy, and seeing those elements, as you say, as marketing and as attempts to sell an expensive book rather than necessarily as the truth about Shakespeare or about the theatre world, I think is a good way to go.
And I think it's generally true that the works that use collaboration are considered worse in the Shakespeare canon in general. There are exceptions like some of the post hoc editions in Macbeth and so on. But when we think of plays like Titus Andronicus, First Henry VI, Henry VIII, Two Noble Kinsmen, they're frequently not so well known or regarded. And in your opinion, just personally, do you think it is true that these are his lesser works, or is there some renegotiation in store for a few of these plays?
I think there's definitely some renegotiation that we need to look at. I think that these are plays often in genres where Shakespeare himself perhaps doesn't feel completely comfortable. That's why he gets a collaborator. So um, and what has happened to literary taste since then is that it has been shaped by Shakespeare and by Shakespearean genres. So the genres that are a little bit at the edge of Shakespeare's capacity, like the kind of Fletcherian pastoral comedy that we get in Two Noble Kinsmen, for instance, um, or perhaps those early ensemble history plays without a central character to sort of structure the play around. They just as they weren't central to Shakespeare's view, they haven't been central to our view because Shakespeare has sort of established the taste by which he is now so valued. So I feel as if they're sort of slightly the same thing in a way. And I definitely think that we should be rethinking the kind of energy that comes from collaborative writing, perhaps in an age, as we've been saying, where highly verbal TV drama is such a staple of the 21st century. We're in a golden age of scripted television
Mm.
with clever dialogue and cleverly verbal television. All of all of which is written, collaboratively and by teams, long series written by teams of writers. Maybe we're more able to accept that now than we had been previously.
Yeah,
And if there, well, go on, Jack.
it's interesting that that the anxiety about a TV writer's room is that it will become lowest common denominator, that the tastes, once you average them out across a whole room of people, will become something quite bland. There
Mm.
seems to be a kind of anti-democratic anxiety in lots of people's attitudes to art making, that anything that's a compromise between lots of people is going to be a compromise that doesn't really attain the heights that it could if a few groups of if a smaller and smaller group of eccentrics, preferably a single eccentric, is working their eccentricity out. So
That's so
it's
interesting. That's making me wonder. I mean, this may be
mhm,
completely
mhm,
a complete non sequitur, but just as you were
mhm,
describing there, it made me think about the British resistance to uh, what's it called? The government by more than one party.
mhm. Yeah, no,
That
what's
we that we've got an electoral system
yeah.
which prioritizes singular, not necessarily eccentric, but we feel as if collaborative government is a terrible leveling of everything, or lowest common
Yeah.
denominator, whereas in other countries they're quite happy with that.
Milo and I collaborated in the writing of a musical about the coalition government.
Coalition, that's the word I've been struggling
Yeah,
for. Yeah,
yeah.
excellent. Were you in the Rose Garden doing that?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
In the and one of the examples where people are very comfortable with collaboration is when the two art forms are different.
yeah.
When you have
It's
composer
clear that this is a
and
person. Yes.
poet, or
Yeah.
um,
Whereas artists like, say, Gilbert and George, where the artist's name has
yes,
become a singular, and there are two individuals who it's quite it's designedly difficult to separate out, and nobody would try actually with that to say, well, which does Gilbert do and which does George do?
mm,
The whole point is that they're a duo.
yeah, and that their reputations are relatively equal
That's right. They
within
don't
their
do anything with
fields.
anyone
There's
else,
not
do
one of
they?
them's not Shakespeare. It's not like Mozart's Requiem, where whoever is going to finish that off is
Yes.
going to
Is
be
not it's just
sneered
really
at.
not Mozart. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's true that Shakespeare's collaborators tend to be sort of not Shakespeare
yeah,
first,
yeah,
and their
and
particular
themselves
identity second.
second.
Yeah,
I'm gonna move over to Othello now. I think we may have lost Milo briefly. He'll hopefully pop back in.
yeah,
Um, the other night I'm back home at the moment in Leeds with my mum visiting, and we were watching the Traitors, and I kept thinking how good Iago would be on the show,
yeah,
sewing all these webs of discord with his words and playing people against each other. And I thought it was funny again on the British mentality that by far the most popular show in this country at the moment cashes in on the audience's most antisocial instincts.
yeah.
So the perverse delight in watching people manipulate each other, lie to each other, abuse each other's trust, and exercise the most Machiavellian, amoral
Yeah,
side of their
absolutely.
intelligence, which is the same appeal as Othello in some ways.
In some ways, isn't it? Although
Yeah.
just as you were saying that, it's such an interesting comparison, and I hadn't quite thought of it before. What's different about how Shakespeare structures Othello, and I sort of wonder why he does this, is that we, the audience, are never in any doubt. So part of
Mm,
the appeal of the traitors is, we're all supposed to be, watching at home and saying, oh, that looked a bit dodgy, or, I don't trust him, because we're playing along. We don't have inside information. Whereas the very first scene of Othello is Iago and Rodrigo talking together about how Iago hates them all, and how he's going to, try and mess things up for him.
and it puts you
So
in a
weird,
pleasant position of power, doesn't it? You have
yes,
you wield the knowledge, and you have power over the characters, and there's a
you do
strange,
have power. Yeah,
yeah.
but I wonder if there's partly a feeling. There's partly a way in which that reduces ultimately the sympathy we can feel with Othello,
Mm,
because
yeah.
we're not encouraged to think, oh, I was taken in by him as well, or he
Mm.
is very, because in a way Iago seems to us absolutely straightforward, and confiding, and tells us what he's doing. So I don't know if that
Oh,
in some way
it's interesting that you
reduces.
feel that way. For me, even in his soliloquies, I think Iago's not being entirely direct with the audience, but maybe this is just my feeling about it.
Well,
It's
it depends
interesting,
whether
yeah.
what you want from Iago is a sense of what's going on, whether you're really sort of fascinated, whether one is fascinated by him and wants to understand, following Coleridge and all of that, his motivation for what he does. But if
Mm,
you are just thinking about what is his behavior in the play, what is his role in the play, his role is to disrupt and bring down Othello in some way, and
yeah.
that is very clear right from the start.
Yeah, it's interesting how appealing he is, despite possibly being the most evil and monstrous character Shakespeare ever wrote. I suppose it's a pleasure watching anyone do anything well, and Iago lies very well, which becomes quite meta when you consider that the whole art of theatre could be called the art of lying well.
Yeah.
I mean, Iago is in a sense the author of Othello. He makes up the plot of the play as it goes along, right
Yeah.
in front of the audience,
Yeah,
thinking
he can do a
aloud.
bit of improvising when the handkerchief
Exactly.
turns out to
Uh,
be, sort of differently presented
yes.
than he expected. Yeah,
Not
absolutely.
and not
Auden
mi
calls him, doesn't he, the
mm,
amateur of tragedy in real life.
yeah, and
So,
not merely about the plot's mechanisms, but also about things like character motivations, plausibility. He almost thinks, what emotion would it be most likely for me to feel right now
yeah.
before eventually feeling it? Concerns which characters within drama very rarely have, but which are the bread and butter of dramatists. Do you think we're experiencing Shakespeare as the dramatist through Iago to an extent?
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea, isn't it? We're definitely, I mean, all those parallels that you've listed are absolutely definitely there. I suppose the counter to that might be that in a way, Iago is much less interesting than that, that he is a kind of plot device to bring about the um, to puncture the kind of hubristic pride of Othello, and that it, we have we have invested all this in him for reasons which perhaps speak to our own lack of interest in Othello. I mean
Hmm.
that's an interesting. I mean, if you say something, everybody studies Othello at the moment in the UK.
Mm.
All A level is the A level play at the moment is Othello,
Okay. Mm.
and so I spend quite a lot of time talking with students about it, in really interesting ways. And what we sometimes talk about is uh, here is here is Othello, a black man in a racist white world, and here is a racist called Iago. Why is it so complicated for us to think, why does he do what he does? I mean, why have we overcomplicated that? Now, in some ways, that's an oversimplification of it, but it's rhetorically helpful in a way to think maybe we have invested Iago with this sort of occluded complexity in ways which speak to our collective unwillingness to invest that much in Othello himself.
Mm. I
So that
suppose.
in a way we
Mm.
enact the same thing that's happening. There's a really interesting thing called the which she calls the Othello syndrome by a brilliant American critic called Diana Thompson, and she says that in when companies are putting on Othello, the black actor who is now always plays Othello,
It's the only
rightly.
non-colorblind role, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It tends to be less familiar because of other casting practices with classical drama.
Mm.
The Iago tends to be the white star, and because his part is so complex and sort of interesting, he kind of spends more time with the director, and he has this kind of meta theatrical sense, so he's almost like the
Mm.
director, and this pushes the
Yeah.
Othello character and the actor more. And I was just reading that, and it really sort of struck me as that the emphasis on Othello is a kind of a version of that, or could be seen in that light.
Yeah, and I suppose Othello's virtues or character traits are um, traits which are profoundly alien to us now. He's a classical hero who's good at war.
Yeah.
We're in a generation that abhors these things
Yeah.
now. People who are good
Yeah.
at waging war were, heroes in almost every
Yeah.
human society before our own. Probably just still the echoes of World War II
Yeah.
hanging over us and affecting our ability to appreciate a great classical warrior.
Mhm.
So, to that extent, he's also uninteresting due to that chance of history. I think Desdemona's interest in Othello is his classicism, or his status as a classical hero, especially compared with all the sort of wealthy, curled darlings
Yeah.
of Venice, who are desk job men. If Rodrigo is anything to go by, quite lackluster suitors.
Mm.
And Desdemona craves this danger, this very manly
Mm.
masculinity in Othello. I think,
Yes, there's the great line,
yeah,
isn't there, when she said she wishes God had made her such a man, and it's not clear
yeah.
whether the line means that she could marry
Such a
or have
man
such
as
a
a
man or
suitor, or
become
whether
one. Yeah.
become one. Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Mm.
her, if we interpret it as her becoming such a man, then her motivations overlap somewhat with Iago's. She's jealous of what Othello is. Um, yeah.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that they're um that these are both versions of sort of wanting to be him.
Mm,
Um yeah,
yeah.
yeah, so that they're, I mean, that would be sort of what René Girard would call sort of mimetic envy, or something. So Girard is really interesting on these sort of violent bromance kind of
Mm.
um, kind of relationships, and how you might see those sort of psychoanalytically, structurally.
One performance sadly lost that would have captured this side of Desdemona very well, and probably the single Shakespeare performance I would go back in time to see, was during the Mexican-American War. Ulysses S. Grant played the role of Desdemona in
How brilliant! How
in,
brilliant!
yeah, for the troops.
That is really
Yeah.
interesting, that it would be worth going back to see, because there's a sort of truism about productions of Othello that either they are Othello's production or
Mm.
they are Iago productions, but they're very, very rarely Desdemona productions.
Yeah, or
Um,
Desdemona and Othello's marriage. That's very rarely the forefront. I mean, the
yeah,
marriage, there's already cracks in the marriage and conflict going on without Iago being there. Iago, I mean, Othello wants to settle down. He's lived this life on the road as a warrior, wants to be integrated into Venetian society. Like Shylock and Merchant of Venice, he's an outsider who's brought into Venetian society, but not brought all the way in, not equal under the law, to do the Venetian sort of dirty work for them, whether it's money lending practices they're not comfortable with, or war. But and Desdemona is wants to get out of Venetian society. They're at cross purposes with each other. Desdemona
yeah,
longs
that's
for
interesting. Does
everything.
Othello want
Yeah.
to settle into Venetian society? I mean, he tells Iago
Mm.
that it's only because he so loves her that he has sort of agreed in a way to
Yeah.
settle down.
I
And the
think they
play,
both regret it. I think they both regret it throughout the play in their marriage. I think, yeah,
interesting.
I think Othello, or at any rate, I think it's the pity. It's for Desdemona's pity that he says is the thing that's new about her. He's explaining all these very Homeric, his life story sounds like Odysseus,
Yeah.
um, tales to her of daring do, and she takes pity on him.
Yes.
So those are the two
Yes.
novel things in both of their lives that they
Yes. And
represent to each
there's a
other.
textual variation, isn't there, between the two versions? She gave me for my pains a world of sighs, which is what we
Ah,
tend to get
mm,
uh, preferred as being more sort of virginal, perhaps, or more appropriate. She gave me for my pains a world of kisses is the other version.
mm,
Um,
okay.
and it's interesting to think about a more perhaps a more autonomous, a more headstrong, a more comic, actually, a kind of comic heroine who knows what she wants, and she wants something that's more exciting than what she's got. Desdemona, that you're describing, Jack, might be perhaps more likely to say a world of kisses.
Mm.
To have given a world of kisses. It's not she who says it, it's Othello.
In another fashionable thing in modern portrayals of Desdemona is to um, show her reciprocating Iago's lust to varying degrees, or at least to show her as a more worldly, sexually knowing and flirty character, especially in that scene on the dockyard. What do you think this version of Desdemona does to the play? Do you think this is an improvement, showing the character like
Well,
this?
it's absolutely there in the play. I mean, in some ways, it's a counter to versions of the play which previously suppressed that, with a sense that Desdemona could only be, had to be a sort of absolutely to be proved to be absolutely innocent in every regard in order to be believed and pitied at the end. So I think it is interesting that Shakespeare has given us that scene, which with a more
Hmm.
knowing Desdemona, but it's part of the what I experience in the play, and it's interesting that some of these disruptions or inconsistencies in Timon, as we were talking about before, might be exactly the kind of thing that are attributed to joint authorship. But with Othello, that isn't the case.
Mm.
I mean, I think Desdemona is a very unevenly presented character. I think there's a representation of her in Venice where she is the comic heroine defying her father and choosing her own husband. I think on the quayside she becomes a sort of, she engages with Iago's rather sort of salty kind of sexually knowing language, but then very quickly in Cyprus she is unable to, and she speaks up, doesn't she, for Cassio and how he should be reinstated, but then she's unable to speak for herself, and then she has that scene with Amelia saying, are there
Mm.
really women who betray their husbands? Now that seems a very different
Yeah,
voice
yeah,
from the voice
true.
on the quayside. So there's a sort of unevenness about Desdemona, about whether she is a strong, clever, comically sort of shaped heroine like Rosalind, or
Or
in As You
a
Like It.
perfectly murderable virgin.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah,
Exactly. And maybe the end of the play is trying to backpedal a bit on Rosalind and give
Yeah.
us something a bit more perfectly murderable, because we're getting towards the murder,
yeah.
and how the play can get as much sympathy for Othello as it can might depend on Desdemona becoming a more passive, tragic heroine, sort of lying down and being murdered.
Mm.
Yeah, it sort of feeds into the Iago as playwright, but Shakespeare as playwright, he needs us to see Desdemona in a certain way at a certain time to
Mm.
motivate our feelings. So Iago does this to Othello to ensure that Desdemona becomes what she needs to be for him
Mm.
to do what he therefore
Yeah.
needs to do. Whereas
Yeah,
for
that's
us, I
interesting.
suppose, yeah, and a
Yeah.
newer audience who aren't so familiar with Desdemona as a type, maybe the quayside scene would feel more important. Just
Yeah.
feel like, this is interesting. Is this what's she up to here? And
Mm,
then never mind. Whereas I think we have this, especially there are many productions that cut that part, cut it down,
mm,
that try to like I recently watched Orson Welles' film version where Desdemona is, I mean, there's two different performances of Desdemona in two different cuts, but in both of them she is sort of a pillar of virtue,
yeah.
and he doesn't risk it essentially with a scene like that
Yeah.
because his version of the play is more elemental. But I think when we come into Othello now, it is already elemental, and
Mm,
we look for it, or we look for it to be contradicted. But it's an interesting point, just that maybe the inconsistency of the character is a device as much as it is a failure in drama.
Mm.
yeah. I mean, it would be part of a. You could make it as part of a wider argument, and again, Timon would be the exception that would be interesting to try and take on board. A wider argument that says that women in Shakespeare's tragedies are plot devices. They are there primarily to help display or bring about certain responses in the male tragic characters. That's their role, and they don't have a role beyond that. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think
Wells.
Desdemona resists that for a while, but her spirit is broken by the
Yeah.
play, by
It's um, in the source material, the main Iago motivation is lust for
is that he's in love with her. Yeah,
is
yeah.
love for Desdemona. Orson Welles sort of in his reading the motivation for Iago is impotence and jealousy of a fellow sexual potency. In the Kenneth Branagh version, it's played gay. It's Iago's lust or love for Othello. There's a lot of discourse about Iago's
Yeah.
asexuality as well. Could you speak a bit about what's going on with Iago's sexuality and the tradition,
Well, again, I
political
think
tradition?
this is a slightly a red herring, or it's an
Mm,
interesting red herring that the 20th century has needed in order to corroborate its primary interest in Iago
mm,
rather than in Othello. But I do think that they're an interesting set of readings in that they establish sex as the primary sort of emotion, or the primary expression of emotion in this play,
mm,
wherever you might find that, which is a different kind of central emotion maybe than we get in other tragedies. So that would be an interesting way to think about Othello as a play about damaging uh, sexual obsession in different in different ways. I mean, the idea that
mm,
Iago is gay, or secretly desires Othello, has some textual corroboration, I suppose, in the kind of mock marriage that they
yeah,
swear to each other um, in Act Three, when this great bravura scene that everybody talks about, where Iago has persuaded Othello from great confidence in Desdemona to being willing to murder her in her bed. That marriage scene does suggest that Iago, in some ways, has taken the place of Desdemona, but perhaps he never, Desdemona never really took the place of Iago. I mean, this is an absolute
mm,
sort of bros before hoes kind of a play, isn't it? That in the end, your military companions are the people you trust and you believe in, not your new, not your relatively new wife. They're never to be believed. But I do think that idea comes that Iago is gay. I mean, comes from a time before the legalization of male homosexuality in
mm.
the UK. It's a way of saying this is how bad and twisted gay men
Okay,
are. So
right.
it's a deeply reactionary and sort of troubling
Mm,
attribution. That doesn't mean that it's not valid, but it does have a sort of politics to it. It comes from a time when you would say, yeah, this is what being gay makes men into, makes them,
yeah.
yeah,
Into these
makes them sick.
Machiavellian, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And in that Act Three dialogue, when Othello commands Iago to find evidence such that no doubt will be permitted, and Iago asks, "Do you actually want to see them in coito, Cassio and Desdemona?" And Othello then responds in sort of jumbled rambling, and sort of begins to command Iago to destroy his own mind,
Mm.
and it is Othello being this man's man, this mercenary in the man's world, so ignorant of sexual matters that he doesn't realize he could simply have sex with Desdemona and thereby determine whether or not she is a virgin, or does he deliberately prevent himself from getting this any conclusive evidence?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Uh,
Do you mean that you imagine? I mean, this is all in some
yeah.
ways a crazy set of questions, isn't it? These are not people who have sex because they don't exist.
Of
But
course,
in
yeah.
the play, aren't they having sex at the Sagittary when has to get up to go to the courtroom when the I mean, there's been an
Um,
interesting prurience about this in criticism, which has wanted to suggest that they don't consummate their marriage. And it is certainly true that the play is quite concerned to keep disrupting them whenever they seem to go off
mm,
stage together. Firstly, with the news of the Turkish threat to Cyprus, then with Cassia's manufactured sort of drunken brawl, and so on. And then, the question about what does it mean when Desdemona asks Emilia to put the wedding sheets on the bed. Is she saying we haven't yet consummated our marriage, or is
Okay,
she
right.
saying
Yeah.
these are the sheets that will recall the sense that we are close and married couple? So yeah, it's a really interesting question.
Yeah, and Othello says, doesn't he, before he murders her, I'll not shed her blood.
Yeah,
Yeah. Um, what do you make of Brabantio, Desdemona's father, at the end of the play being proven completely right in all
yeah,
of his prejudices against Othello? He
yeah.
says, you can't marry a Moor, it's an abhorrence against nature. Within a few days, his daughter's dead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that we're reminded of him in the last scene, which is
Hmm.
which is unnecessary, unless it's to make that point that you're making. So thy match was mortal to him. So not only was Brabantio was not a sort of nasty old bigot, but that he was so wounded and troubled by Desdemona's marriage that he too has died. Um, and it's a good job he's not alive to see it. I mean, that could all be part of a reading which says, I mean, this has been the great sort of late 20th, 21st century question about this play. Is this a play that is racist, or is it a play about racism? That's to say, does it engage with and set at a distance and look at and interrogate prejudices based on race, or does it actually participate in them? And I think if you were arguing the second, that it is itself racist, the Brabantio would be an exhibit in that, I think, that having seemed at the beginning to be the blocking figure who is stopping the comic marriage, so he's a father like Aegeus is in Midsummer Night's Dream. Nobody can imagine the end of Midsummer Night's Dream saying, well, Aegeus was right all along, he should have gone into a
Mm.
convent. The whole point is that he is wrong, and that he needs to be circumvented, and that's a comic, the blocking figure in the new comedy of Terence and the other Roman playwrights. That's a really common structure, isn't it? So
Mm.
Brabantio looks like that figure, but then recasting him at the end, given what has happened, as a terrible prophet,
Mm.
it sort of changes the genre of the play and changes the resonance of that in some disturbing ways.
Yeah. What?
But
Never. Yeah. Go on.
well, I suppose it's interesting because while he's right, he's wrong in the mechanism, and there's this sense sometimes felt in Othello that it was his virtue that became his evil, and that he was. I mean, his quote is of one that loved not wisely
Mm, yeah.
but too well. The idea being that only his supreme amount of love could convert into this murderous jealousy, which is a paradox. And it's one mirrored in Timon when he says, unwisely, not ignobly have I given. And there's this notion that maybe Timon is become so wretched. I mean, it's implied, no middle way. He's of the extremes, but becomes so wretched because he has such high standards for humanity, and they're consistently unmet.
Yeah,
And that in all of his statements, there's an equal negative statement. So him saying all of these things that are true of all the caitiffs of mankind, where in fact, if his anti-reality were true, then we'd live in a sort of paradise. And so Othello, he was too honest and too believing. And if he was right, I mean, I suppose we wouldn't justify murdering Desdemona, especially in a modern context. But he says this interesting line, or she'll betray other men, almost
Mm.
like this is a universal defense of men against such
yeah,
women as he believes her to be. And so in that frame, again, in a somewhat maniacal, somewhat madman frame, he is doing what he believes to be a good act, which would probably by Brabantio be agreed to be good if his premises were true, which they're not. But there's a
yeah. I mean, it's an interesting point about it goes back to what we were talking about Desdemona's character. It's clearly very important to Shakespeare that Desdemona, it's the only defense of Desdemona that she is absolutely pure. Um, and there is some that allows for what is deeply troubling to us now, that if she were not, there might be more justification
Mm.
for Othello's conduct. Yeah, I mean, one that loved not wisely but too well. It's a really, really interesting line, isn't it? I was looking at it just recently and wondering whether where he loved not wisely but too well was with Iago, in fact. That it was in believing Iago that this has gone wrong rather than in Desdemona. It's a possibility. I mean, since Desdemona is so absent from that final speech, it could be read in that way. Yeah, I don't know what we do with that, given, as you say, that doesn't really work for the modern age. I can see you might make a historical argument about that, but it's a deeply distasteful argument to me to go myself with the idea that only sort of supreme love can turn into this murderous jealousy, just because as we're in an epidemic, aren't we, of this kind of violence, intimate partner violence against women. Has reached epidemic proportions, and it seems very, very troubling to suggest that in some way that is about extreme yeah, it seems troubling to me. Yeah,
it's the perpetrator's version of what is going on as well. That I am, I just love you so much
that no one else is
yeah
going to have you. Or
exactly
that's right. See,
yeah.
these are possessive, and it's a deeply possessive speech, isn't it, about the Indian or Judean who threw a pearl away richer than all his tribe. It's about having had a treasure and throwing it away. So even at the moment of acknowledging what he's done, he's thinking in these possessive terms.
Yeah. Well, when we were talking about Desdemona's sort of status and character changing as she gets closer to the murder, I was just thinking of the film Psycho came into my head, where we start with this woman who's commits some kind of smallish financial crime, has run away with some money, is in this low down on the virtue ladder, but she's not murdered while she's like running with the money. She's not murdered in her clothes. She's murdered in the completely innocent position. You need to get her into the place where she's completely encapsulated in complete helplessness and innocence in the shower before she's murdered. And Othello does sort of similar things.
It's a really, really interesting
Yeah.
comparison, actually. I think it would be an interesting comparison. It'd be interesting to go with what you were saying about Iago as a dramatist figure. Thinking, I mean, the Hitchcock director cameo kind of thing could be really fun to think more about there. I'm glad you made that comparison.
Yeah, great. We're gonna sort of wind slowly to the ends now. I just one other thing I'd like to talk about before we end is I'm really interested in Iago's ultimate downfall being overlooking the capacity of goodness in his wife, overlooking, sorry, her capacity for self-sacrifice. His underestimation of Amelia, he can't take account of her capacity for good. Do you think his silence at the end of the play is simply stupefaction and shock at this capacity of Amelia? Or do you think that this is a bad reading?
Well, it's a really interesting reading. I mean, Amelia is I talked a minute ago about how Desdemona is a sort of bumpy character, and Amelia is a really bumpy character, isn't she? That
Yeah,
she knows she can't begin to imagine that stealing the handkerchief and giving it to her husband is going to be a good thing, but nevertheless she does it, and she betrays Desdemona in ways which are irretrievable, and yet she comes through in this extraordinary way at the end, and she gains. There's a moment in the last scene of the play where Desdemona is expiring in the room. Excuse me, and I'm expiring myself, and her cries are picked up by Amelia outside as if her voice goes to Amelia. So I think that reimagining of sorry, very bad timing. Yeah. That reimagining of Amelia is really interesting. You talk for a bit while I find my voice.
Yeah, we sort of come to an end. Do you have another burning question, Milo?
Well, my question before I vanished into the void briefly was if of the collaborations, if there was one you could personally revitalized, personally reintroduced to the great canon? Is there one that comes to mind?
Mhm.
That's a great question. I feel that both, as I say, I think that Timon is ripe for a new uh, a new production and some new energy, and that may come from a more global sense of the play's resonances. That may come from a more East European theatre tradition. That would be great to see. I have been very interested in All's Well That Ends Well, which is a comedy which sort of outstrips comedy quite knowingly. That title can't really be straight, I think. So I'd be really interested to see how we could get that back. What are the ways that we could understand that in the 21st century? There's a thing that George Bernard Shaw says about the problem, so-called problem plays. That was a Victorian definition of Troilus and Cressida and Measure for Measure and All's Well. They're willing. Shakespeare wants to start at the 20th century if the 17th century would only let him. But it feels that with All's Well, Measure for Measure, we have got back Troilus and Cressida at points. All's Well, we haven't. So maybe we just need to nudge that on to the 21st century.
Emma, it was a real delight to speak to you. Thank you so much for making time. This was great.
I love talking to you. Thanks for putting those two plays together, and forgive me for my coughing over empathy with the smothered Desdemona.
Okay. Have a lovely
Right,
day.
you are
Yeah.
forgiven. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thanks so much.